Hello. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to give this lecture, and I'm going to be talking about some of my research that's looking at the influences on children's mathematics learning and trying to understand why learning mathematics is so complex. So I'll start by considering the importance of learning maths and what it is children need to know before thinking about how we can split mathematics up into multiple different components. I'll then talk about some studies that look at the influence of cognitive skills on learning mathematics, and then consider the influence of children's mathematical learning experiences. And at the end I'll highlight what I think it is we know so far and what it is that we still need to know. So why study mathematics learning? Well, we know that mathematics skills are really important, and in fact they have been found to be linked to employment prospects, well-being and quality of life. However, we also know that a large number of individuals struggle with learning mathematics. In fact, so recent data shows that a quarter of children leave primary school without reaching the expected level. And perhaps more worryingly, over half of adults don't have the numeracy skills they need just for coping with modern life, with dealing with money and making decisions about health and so on. And there's some early emerging evidence that COVID pandemic and in particular the school lockdowns has had a particular impact on mathematics learning. So it's really important to understand the processes of learning mathematics and to find out how we can best support children's learning. And this is what the field of mathematical cognition has been trying to do. So it's still a relatively young field, but has grown enormously in the past 2 decades and has been making some progress in understanding what it is that's involved from a cognitive perspective in learning mathematics. So to start thinking about the challenge of learning mathematics, I think it might be helpful to think about what children are expected to learn. So I've got some examples of items that are taken from the end of primary school maths SATs exams. So these are taken by children when they're about 11 years old. So some of the items include just basic abstract arithmetic of whole numbers and rational numbers. There are also sort of classical word problems where children need to work out what arithmetic operation they need to do first, and then they need to do it. There are also items that involve understanding of symbols. So here it's looking at greater than symbol, less than symbol, and the equal sign. Now, this question asks about different strategies for solving problems and asks children to decide which are valid and appropriate to use. And we know that the choice of strategy is a really important thing that differentiates children with better or less good mathematics achievement in how well they can choose a strategy and perhaps choosing the most efficient and effective strategy. This item doesn't focus on exact answers to problems because sometimes we just want to estimate. So this is an item about estimating the magnitude of the outcome of a problem. And so all of these examples are from the looking at number or arithmetic, but of course mathematics is much broader than that, and so there are also items that include geometry, so here looking at symmetry. So these examples show what a wide range of skills and knowledge are involved in learning mathematics. And it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of people complain about the SATs being a very restricted view of what it means to think mathematically or reason mathematically. So if anything, these items underestimate the range of activities that are involved in learning mathematics. So given that maths is so broad and involves so many different types of things, how could we usefully divide it up into components if we want to look at some of the processes and mechanisms of learning maths? Well, we could think about different domains of mathematics. So these are the domains that are used in the national curriculum, for example. But these don't really get very specific about what it is that children have to learn or what it is children have to do. So we might also want to think about the types of knowledge that children need to learn. And we often see this split into 3, so procedural skill, conceptual understanding, and factual knowledge. So procedural skill is the ability to carry out a sequence of operations accurately and efficiently, and can be thought of as knowing how, for example. Conceptual understanding is about understanding the relationships and the principles that underlie a domain, and so this can be thought of as knowing why. And finally, factual knowledge, which is the ability to retrieve key facts, such as number bonds or times tables or the definitions of shapes, for example. And this can be thought of as knowing that. So these are three very different types of knowledge that children need to acquire when they're learning maths. And of course, each domain will have its own factual, procedural and conceptual knowledge. So we can get quite precise when we think about the types of knowledge that children need to acquire. And I think it's this level that we need to be focusing on if we want to try and understand cognitive processes and mechanisms that are involved in learning maths, and that might help us to understand why some children have particular difficulties. So you might think, well, perhaps there are these different levels of knowledge, but actually if overall achievement is driven just by one of them, for example, procedural skill, then perhaps we only need to look at one, and it doesn't matter that there are these different types of knowledge. But actually, it seems that all three of these types of knowledge contribute independently to overall mathematics achievement. So I looked at this in a study with Lucy Cragg, where we were looking at which components of arithmetic were associated with overall maths achievement. And this study had 293 participants across 4 different age groups. So the youngest children were towards the end of primary school, and then there were 2 groups of children who were at secondary school and also university students. So in this study we measured overall mathematics achievement using the Wyatt, and then we also had measures tapping into these specific types of knowledge. So we measured number fact knowledge, we measured procedural skill, and we measured conceptual understanding. And we found that all 3 of these were independently associated with the Wyatt maths reasoning scores. And we looked to see whether these relationships were the same across each different age group. And we found that there were no interactions with age group. So all 3 components were independently associated with maths reasoning for all of the different age groups. And we've recently replicated and extended this with children aged 12 to 14 years, where we looked across different domains as well. So we included algebra and geometry, and we found that those also make additional independent contributions, but all these three key components, different types of knowledge, are again important. So it seems that if we want to understand the process of mathematics learning overall, we need to consider all of these different components of maths. And as might be expected by these independent relationships, it seems that the relationship between these different components isn't simple. So just because children do well in one component, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll do well in another component. So this was something I looked at a long time ago in my PhD work in a study with children aged between 8 and 9 years old. And we were looking at arithmetic, and we were looking at procedural and conceptual understanding of arithmetic. So for our procedural skill measure, we looked at children's accuracy at solving 3-term addition and subtraction problems, so like the example here. And these were designed to be quite difficult for the children of that age group to work out, but certainly achievable. And then we also looked at children's understanding of the relationship between addition and subtraction. So our conceptual understanding measure was whether children could identify inverse relationships. So as in this second problem, 15 add 12, take away 12, could children see that this was an inverse relationship and they actually didn't have to do any calculation to work out the answer to this problem? And so we looked at children's performance on these 2 measures, and we did a cluster analysis on their scores. And we used a hierarchical cluster analysis that suggested that there were 3 meaningful groups that could be distinguished. And we found that one of the groups had children who had relatively good performance on both types of items. So they had good conceptual understanding and a relatively good procedural skill. So we had designed these items to be quite difficult. So getting half of them right was quite a good achievement for children of this age. So cluster 1 were children who were relatively strong in both procedural skill and conceptual understanding. And then cluster 2 were the children who were relatively weaker than their peers in both components. So they didn't do so well on either the conceptual items or the procedural skill items. But then of most surprise, we found a group of children who had really strong conceptual understanding, despite having really relatively weak procedural skills. So these children, the relationship between their conceptual and procedural knowledge was very different because one was far more advanced than the other. And after this study, I actually reanalysed a number of different studies that had been done using this method and found similar groupings in many of these studies. And then it's also sometimes found that there's a fourth group who have stronger procedural skills than conceptual understanding. But the key thing is that there's no simple relationship between children's performance in different mathematical components. And so we can't infer anything about children's level of knowledge of one component from what we know about their performance of another component. So if we want to understand children's knowledge of mathematics, their learning, we need to consider all these different components separately. But perhaps you're thinking that, well, if we just use an overall maths achievement measure, then that's going to tap into all three of these different components, and that can tell us what we need to know, and it doesn't matter about thinking about measuring these things separately. But actually, it seems that maths achievement measures aren't necessarily very helpful in telling us much about children's individual skills. So we looked at this in a study with children aged between 5 and 6 years old. And we measured their procedural skills. So because they were young children, their procedural skills was focusing on counting skills and simple emerging arithmetic skills. Their conceptual understanding was focusing on their understanding of arithmetic relationships. So could they understand how the outcomes of adding quantities in different orders, for example. And then in this study, we were also interested in general cognitive skills. So we also measured working memory. And then we also used, again, the Wyatt. Here we used the Wyatt Maths Composite, so a really broad measure of overall maths achievement. And again, we used cluster analysis to look at children, groups of children with different profiles. And we entered all 4 of these measures into the cluster analysis. And this suggested that there were 5 different clusters that could be meaningfully distinguished. Now, if we just look at performance on the Wyatt measure, then we found quite a simple pattern. So if you look in the figure, you can see that there was one group, cluster 1, who were particularly weak in relation to their peers. And then there was one group, cluster 5, who were particularly strong in relation to their peers in terms of overall maths achievement. But then there were also these 3 groups who were indistinguishable in terms of their Wyatt scores. So there was no differences between these 3 clusters if we just look at their overall maths achievement. So then what happens if we look at these groups in more detail, focusing on their scores on the other measures? Well, we find that there's one group who have weak conceptual understanding, but average procedural skill and working memory capacity. We found one group that had weak procedural skills, and they had average or slightly above average conceptual understanding and working memory capacity. And then finally, we had one group who had weak working memory capacity, but were performing about average in terms of their conceptual understanding and their procedural skills. So if you remember, all 3 of these groups were indistinguishable if we just look at their overall maths achievement. But of course, if we wanted to support these children's learning, or if we wanted to know what they needed to help them progress, it's likely to be very different for the children across these three clusters. But a single maths achievement measure is not going to tell us what we need to know. So it's really important to bear in mind that performance on overall mathematics achievement measures might not tell us much about children's performance when we think about these individual components or the specific types of knowledge that children need to acquire. So I hope I've convinced you that it's important to think about different components of mathematics, and we can't just think of maths as a single domain for which different measures are just interchangeable. So I'm now going to go on and think about why this matters and the impact of this when we consider the different cognitive skills that are involved in learning mathematics. So there's been a lot of attention over the past couple of decades looking at what cognitive skills are associated with individual differences in concurrent and future mathematics. And one of the problems is that much of this research has actually just considered overall maths achievement, or perhaps has just used one specific mathematical task, for example, just looking at their speed of abstract calculation, for example. But as we've seen, if we want to understand how cognitive skills contribute to overall maths achievement, then we need to consider these different components of maths. So there's been a wide range of cognitive skills that have been identified as being associated with maths. This includes working memory, inhibition, spatial skills, language, and there's many more. It seems to be all the time new studies coming out suggesting that something else is key to maths learning. And so we need to think about how do we put all these different pieces together? How do we think about the way that the general cognitive skills that are involved relate to these different specific components of maths? And I found it helpful to think about this in terms of a hierarchical model that was put forward by David Geary. So Geary talked about achievement in a particular mathematical domain, building on a set of supporting competencies. So this might be the different mathematical components that I have been talking about, so things like conceptual understanding or procedural skill, but it also could be domain-specific skills. For example, we might think here in terms for young children as counting skills as being a really important supporting competency for overall mathematics. So here we're focusing on the specific things that are specific to mathematics. And then these in turn build on domain general skills. So Geary in his model includes central executive, the language system and the visuospatial system, but any of these other domain general skills that have been implicated in maths learning could fit in the model here. So according to this model, overall maths achievement arises out of this hierarchical relationship between general cognitive skills, specific mathematics components, building together into overall maths achievement. So one implication of this is that to understand the role of these skills really in maths achievement, we can't miss out this middle layer, and so we really need to think about specific components of maths and how they explain or don't explain the relationship between general cognitive skills and overall maths achievement. So this is something that we've tested, so with this work again with Lucy Cragg, within the domain of arithmetic, where we wanted to see whether Geary's model was put forward as a theoretical hypothetical model, and we wanted to see whether actually we could find evidence to support this within the domain of arithmetic. So this is from the study that I mentioned earlier, where we had participants in 4 groups aged from age 8 to undergraduate students. And so, as I mentioned before, we measured maths achievement and also factual, procedural and conceptual measures of arithmetic. But we also measured a number of domain general cognitive skills. So we measured verbal and visuospatial working memory. We looked at inhibition and shifting. And in terms of the inhibition tasks, we had 2 inhibition tasks. So one involved dealing with numerical information, so processing numerical information, and then the other was from a completely separate domain, so that was an animal Stroop task, so completely unrelated to numbers and mathematics. And what we did, first of all, we carried out separate hierarchical regression models looking at which of these cognitive skills were associated with different mathematics measures. And we found some different patterns according to the different components of mathematics that we were focusing on. So first of all, if we look at the overall maths reasoning measure, so this is our overall mathematics achievement measure, we found that there were 2 significant two variables that were significantly associated with overall maths reasoning, which was both of the working memory measures, so both verbal and visuospatial working memory. But then if we look at the more specific measures of arithmetic knowledge, first the factual knowledge, here we found that as well as the working memory measures, the numerical inhibition task was also independently associated with factual knowledge. And then we found the same pattern for our specific measure of procedural skills, that both the working memory measures and the numerical inhibition measure were significant here. And if you look at the R-square values, we can see that there's less of the variance in these specific measures that are explained by these cognitive skills in comparison to the overall maths achievement. And then finally, for conceptual understanding, it was only verbal working memory that was significantly associated. And here there was very little variance in conceptual understanding scores. It was explained by these cognitive skills. So the Geary model suggests that these basic cognitive skills are related to maths achievement because of the relationship with these specific components of mathematics. So we tested for this using mediation models, and we were just focusing on working memory here because it was only working memory that had the overall association with mathematics achievement. And this diagram here summarises the results of both the regression models that I've mentioned and the mediation models. And we found that both for both visuospatial and verbal working memory, we found that these specific components, so the factual knowledge, procedural skill and conceptual understanding, partially mediated the relationship between working memory and mathematics. But there was also a substantial direct effect. So this suggests that Geary's right in terms of thinking of a hierarchical relationship here, that the components, these domain general skills, contribute to these specific components of mathematics, and that they in turn contribute to this overall, determining our overall mathematics achievement level. However, we also found that there's an important role for working memory that's not explained by these individual components. So working memory has some other role to play in overall maths achievement. Now, it might be that we just, in this particular study, we didn't measure enough of the components, and because the maths achievement measure was a really broad measure of maths achievement, perhaps the problem is that our specific components were all focused on arithmetic, and if we'd used some broader measures, then we would find more mediation. There would be a less substantial direct effect. Well, actually, we've just recently replicated this in a study where we did have more measures, including algebra and geometry, and we found that they too acted as partial mediators between the working memory and the overall maths achievement. But again, there was still a significant direct relationship between working memory and maths achievement. So this suggests that part of the reason why domain general skills are associated with overall achievement is because we need them in order to have these particular types of knowledge. But that's not the only reason why working memory is important. And we think probably that one explanation for this direct effect is the role of working memory in problem solving more generally. So maths achievement measures typically involve lots of different types of items, and you're switching from one to another, from domain to domain and type of problem to type of problem. And perhaps working memory has a role in identifying what it is that children are being asked to do on each item, and to perhaps build a model of the problem and to work out what it is that they need to do. And that role for working memory isn't captured by these specific measures, because in these specific measures it's quite clear what we're measuring, and children are quite clear on what they need to do, and so that wouldn't be captured at all in those measures. But that's just a suggestion, and we need to do some more work to see if that's right. So, as I mentioned before, there are lots of domain general skills that have been associated with mathematics. But there's also been lots of interest in identifying domain-specific skills that are associated with overall mathematics. So rather than just thinking of mathematical components as these broad types of knowledge, such as conceptual or procedural, thinking about domain, very sort of lower level and specific domain specific skills that play an important role in mathematics. And so, for example, there's been work recently looking at magnitude comparison or order processing, and suggesting that this is really key for mathematics learning. But if we think about these as well within the Geary model, then they will also form part of these supporting competencies, and will also draw on underlying domain general skills. And so if we want to understand the role that these specific maths skills play, we need to understand how maths achievement arises out of the combination of these domain-specific and these domain general skills. And so that's something that we've been working on in a couple of different areas. So I'll talk about those now. So one area that's received a lot of attention over the last decade or so is non-symbolic magnitude comparison skills. So the question has been asked whether the precision with which you can compare two non-symbolic quantities is related to maths achievement. And this is often measured using dot comparison tasks. So participants see two sets of dots like this, and they're asked to choose, are there more dots on the right, in the set on the right or in the set on the left. And the proposal's been made that how precisely you can do these comparisons is related to maths achievement, overall maths achievement. And in fact, meta-analyses indicate that there's a small but reliable association between performance on a dot comparison task and performance of overall mathematics achievement. And so some people have suggested that this underlying sense of magnitude is a really important influence on our learning of numbers and mathematics. However, it might be that that general cognitive skills are playing a role here. And in particular, I think there's a plausible role for inhibition skills when we think about this relationship between dot comparison task performance and maths achievement. And the reason for this is because of the way that we typically do these dot comparison tasks. So when we're measuring non-symbolic comparison skills using these dot comparison tasks, we want participants to be comparing the number of dots and not just some other continuous magnitude. So we don't want them just to choose the bigger dots, for example, or the dots that look like they take up more area, for example. So a common technique to deal with this is to have two different types of trials on the dot comparison task. So these include congruent tasks. So the example at the top, example A here, is a congruent trial. And in this trial, the array that has more dots also has bigger dots, and those dots are more spread out. So these sort of continuous features of the array are congruent with the number. But then you also have trials that are incongruent. So, for example, the example B here, where the array with fewer dots is the one that has the bigger dots and that takes up more area. And so these continuous properties are incongruent with the number of dots. And we're asking participants to ignore these superficial features and just focus on the number of dots, and in each trial just to pick the array that is more numerous. But if they're having to sometimes ignore these kind of surface features of the arrays, then it's plausible that they need inhibition to complete the task, because they've got to stop themselves just picking the array that looks bigger because it has bigger dots in it, for example. And since we've already just seen that inhibition is associated with certain components of maths, then perhaps this role for inhibition could explain the link between dot comparison task performance and maths achievement. And so we looked at this in a couple of different ways. First, in a study with 80 children aged from 4 to 11 years old. So we had a wide age range here, and we were just looking at their dot comparison task performance and a measure of arithmetic skill. And we looked, normally people when we're looking at the relationship between dot comparison task and overall maths achievement, the relationship is looked at for the dot comparison task as a whole. But instead of that, we separated out the incongruent trials and the congruent trials. And the graph here shows on the left the relationship between dot comparison performance and an arithmetic test for the incongruent trials, and on the right panel it's for the congruent trials. And you can see quite clearly here that it's only the incongruent trials that were related to arithmetic skill performance in this task. And in fact, when we compare these correlations, we can see that the correlation with mathematics is significantly stronger for the incongruent than the congruent trials. And this is easier to explain according to a role for inhibition than due to a sort of an underlying process of the role of kind of magnitude comparison skills. And then the second thing we did to explore this question was to look and see, well, if we can control for inhibition, then do we still find a relationship between dot comparison performance and maths achievement? And we looked at this in a study with children aged between 7 and 10 years old, and they completed a dot comparison task, a standard inhibition measure, and a standard maths achievement measure. And we did a hierarchical regression where we first put the inhibition scores, the NEPSI scores, into the model, and then we added the dot comparison score, and we found that dot comparison wasn't significantly associated with maths achievement once we controlled for inhibition. So again, this seems to suggest that it's inhibition that's driving this relationship between dot comparison and maths achievement, rather than the domain-specific skill of magnitude comparison that's important. And of course, we could argue that almost any skill consists of other lower-level skills, and whenever we measure anything, our task is going to require more than just the specific constructs that we're trying to measure. But I think it is important to try and tease apart the role of domain general skills and basic mathematical skills, such as magnitude comparison here. And it's particularly the case when we think about intervention. So if the relationship between non-symbolic magnitude comparison and mathematics is driven by underlying domain general skills, then there's unlikely to be any benefit on mathematics achievement from giving children magnitude comparison training, because that's not what's driving the relationship. Now, this is an active area of research, and I should say that some people have also found that inhibition explains this relationship, whereas there's other studies that suggest there's a relationship over and above inhibition. So we're not sure at the moment, but I think it draws attention to the fact that we can't just think about mathematical skills or domain-specific skills without thinking about where domain general skills are also involved. So I've shown you a couple of examples about how maths achievement arises out of a combination of domain general skills and specific components of maths or specific mathematical skills. And in particular, I've looked at a couple of examples where the relationship between domain general skills and overall achievement is either partially explained by maths skills, or where the domain general skill itself explains the relationship between maths achievement and the maths skill. So that's been looking at mediation. But what about moderation? So does the relationship between some of our specific maths skills and maths achievement, or domain general skills and maths achievement, is it altered by children's level of performance of another skill? So do we need to think about the interaction of domain general skills and domain specific skills in understanding differences in mathematics achievement? So this is a question that we looked at in a study with children aged 5 to 6 years old. And here again, we were looking at measuring procedural skills, conceptual understanding, and working memory. And our maths achievement measure was again the Wyatt. And we wanted to look at what explained variance in maths achievement measure, in our maths achievement measure. And in a regression model, we looked not only whether each of these measures were significantly associated themselves, and we found that they were, so these three components were all significantly associated with maths achievement. But then we also looked at the interaction between these terms. So we looked at all the two-way interactions and the three-way interaction. And we found that there were relationships here. So the interaction between procedural and conceptual knowledge was significantly associated with maths reasoning, and also the three-way interaction, including working memory, was significantly associated with mathematics. So it's not enough just to look at these skills in isolation. Children's overall outcomes are not just determined by their procedural skill or their conceptual understanding or their working memory, but in the combination of these skills, and that some may perhaps are more or less important depending on the children's level with one of the other components. So if we look at these, what did these interactions look like? So if we look first at the two-way interaction between procedural skills and conceptual understanding. So this graph shows the impact of having a score one standard deviation above or below the mean in either procedural skill or conceptual understanding, and what the impact of this was on mathematics achievement. And we can see here that it's the combination of having high procedural skills and high conceptual understanding that has such impact on maths achievement scores. So they're not simply additive. And this is why it's so important when we think about maths learning and education that we're not just teaching procedures, because good procedural skill on its own won't get you very far, but we need children to have good procedural skills but also good understanding that they combine with these procedural skills. And then what about the three-way interaction? So when we then look at working memory, so this graph now takes that relationship between procedural skill and conceptual understanding and separates it out for children who had low working memory or high working memory. And we can see here again that it's the combination of having high procedural skill, high conceptual understanding, and high working memory that's so valuable. And in fact, if we compare across with the children who were missing just one component, who perhaps didn't have great working memory or didn't have great procedural skill or conceptual understanding, we can see that they have these much more similar levels of maths achievement. But actually, there aren't huge differences between these different components. And so it suggests, and I think one thing that we really want to understand more about is how children may be able to compensate for weaknesses in one area through strengths in another area. So perhaps children who have low working memory can cope better if they have good conceptual understanding, because that allows them to find clever ways to solve problems, or computationally efficient ways for solving problems, and so they won't be so impacted by their working memory. But these kind of compensations is something that we don't really know enough about, and we need to learn more. So hopefully I've shown you that maths is this multi-componential skill, and that it draws on a complex relationship of domain general and domain specific skills that seem to be involved. And so finally, I just want to consider briefly the role of children's mathematical learning experiences and how that is really important to consider alongside these cognitive skills when trying to understand why some children do well in learning maths and why some children might struggle. So I think it's really important to remember that we can't look at mathematical cognition in a vacuum. So maths is something that children are very influenced by their learning experiences, be that informal learning experiences, playing, and their early interactions they have, but also the approaches to teaching that are used, and the specific mathematical materials that are used. And we've got evidence that these impact not just on children's overall achievement or their overall rate of learning, but also they may have specific impact on some of these specific components of maths, or some of the skills that they need to acquire. And I think this is really an emerging area of research that we don't know enough about. But to give you a bit of an indication of why I think this is important to look at, I'm going to mention a couple of examples where we've started to try and unpick some of this or understand what's going on. So the first example is looking at children's learning of number symbols, and the second is looking at students' use of conceptually based arithmetic strategies. So first of all, thinking about children's when they're first learning number symbols, they typically get exposed to them in many different ways. But it's very common to see examples like this. So this comes from a number book, and typically in these number books you'll see that there are different representations given for each of the different numbers. So here they have 1 fire engine, 2 ducks, 3 socks, 4 tomatoes. And so each time children are given shown a different number word, a number symbol, and presumably hear the number word when the book's being read to them, then the objects that they're looking at associating with this changes. And this is presumably done to keep children's interest, to make it a very cheerful, brightly coloured kind of book. But is this a helpful approach for learning number symbols? Well, we made a first attempt to look at this in an artificial symbol learning experiment. And this is a study taken from the PhD by Amy Bennett. Now, the reason for doing an artificial symbol learning experiment here is that it's really hard to study this with young children who are actually learning numbers, because we can't control the exposure that they get to different symbols and different contexts. So this artificial symbol experiment approach is a really helpful approach, but of course we have to bear in mind that there are important differences between a 7-year-old and a 2 or 3-year-old. However, so we looked at this with children in a pre-registered study with children aged between 7 and 9 years old. And they were shown a series of novel number symbols, which was paired with particular quantities, and their job was to try and learn the quantities associated with the different number symbols. And the symbols were paired either with abstract images or images of concrete items. So, for example, here we can see on the left where the symbol has been paired with just a set of dots, and on the right where the symbol has been paired with a set of flowers. And there were actually 3 different conditions. So children either saw just all abstract, so all dots, or they saw a particular concrete representation like these flowers, but they were the same for all of the symbols. Or they had different concrete representations that differed for each symbol. So that's like the number book example, where each symbol was paired with a different number of different types of things. And we tested children's learning of the symbols by giving them a symbolic magnitude comparison task where they were shown the two symbols, shown two of the symbols. They learnt 7 in total. They were shown 2 of the symbols, and they had to pick the one that was associated with the bigger quantity. And what we found, so this violin plot shows children's performance on that symbolic comparison task at the end. And we found there was a significant difference here where the abstract or the single concrete representation were more effective than these multiple concrete representations. So where children saw a different item for each symbol, they didn't learn as much about the symbols. So obviously this is, lots of questions remain about this, and there's more studies needed before we can draw strong conclusions. But it's interesting, I think, to consider how this kind of research might help us know more about how to make games and resources the most effective for teaching the early stages of learning number. And we really need to think about how these materials that we're using might influence what children are learning from them. So that was an example from looking at something that happens at the very beginning of children's maths learning. And the second example comes from much later on, thinking about university students' use of conceptually based arithmetic shortcuts. So if we give individuals a problem like this, 6 plus 38 minus 35, people vary in their strategies. So some people will just solve it left to right, they'll add the 38 and then they'll subtract the 35. But others look at this and think, oh, actually there's an easier way I can do this. I'll start with the right hand side, I'll do the subtraction first, and then I'll do the addition. And knowing that that's okay to do it that way requires or indicates some understanding implicitly or explicitly in the associativity principle. So this principle indicates that where you have addition and subtraction elements like this, they can be decomposed and recomposed in different ways, and it doesn't affect the total. So you'll get the same answer if you work left to right or if you start with a subtraction. And so Jo Eves has looked at students' use of these conceptually based sort of shortcut strategies. So how, to what extent do individuals see that they can find an easier way of solving these? So she looked at this in her PhD research. And one of the things that she found was that students' knowledge of operation order rules seemed to interfere with their use of this conceptual shortcut. So when she asked some students why they didn't use the shortcut and why they did the longer version of working left to right, many participants spontaneously mentioned Bodmas as the reason that they'd done this. And so Jo looked into this relationship in a bit more detail. So if you recall, Bodmas is this acronym that's supposed to help us remember order of operation rules. So we have to do brackets first, and then orders or indices, then we can do division or multiplication, and finally addition or subtraction. Now, Bodmas shouldn't have anything to do with the type of associativity problem that Jo was using, because addition and subtraction should be at the same level. So Bodmas really breaks down into these different levels where the division and multiplication can be done interchangeably, and the addition and subtraction can be done interchangeably. But it seems that lots of students remembered Bodmas, but they didn't understand them in this proper way, and in fact they interpreted them in an overly literal way. And so learning this acronym perhaps interfered with their understanding because they'd been overly literal in their interpretation of it. And Jo designed a task where she measured different interpretations of Bodmas, and she did indeed find that in a pre-registered study she found that students who had this literal interpretation of Bodmas were less likely to use the conceptually based shortcut on the associativity problems than students who didn't hold an overly literal interpretation. So the key thing here is that the way that students had been introduced to operation order interfered with their conceptual understanding of something quite unrelated. So it really shouldn't have anything to, operation order rules shouldn't have anything to do with use of an associativity shortcut. But this knowledge was interfering because of the way that they'd been introduced to it using this acronym. And just as an aside, it's interesting to think about the role that these acronyms might have, because actually it turns out they're culturally specific. So in the US, they don't talk so much about Bodmas, but they talk about PEMDAS. And here, the multiplication, the M and the D are reversed. And so this different acronym could lead students to have very different conceptions about what they can and they can't do when solving different problems. And so the key thing here is that the mathematical materials that we use to support learning might have somewhat unexpected impacts on students' specific knowledge, understanding and skills. And so we really need to know more when we're thinking about the cognitive skills involved in learning maths. We can't do that without also looking at the impacts of different mathematical experiences and mathematical materials and how they might interact with the cognitive skills that are involved. Okay, so just to conclude, well, I've tried to show how maths learning is really complex, and I think this is what makes it really interesting to study. We know now that maths isn't a single skill, but is multi-componential, and importantly here, when we're thinking about doing research, we need to remember that different measures of mathematics aren't interchangeable. So we need to know in any study what specific component we're interested in and make sure we're measuring that. We're starting to see how a complex set of domain general and domain specific skills is involved in maths learning and performance, but we really need to do more to focus on specific mechanisms and processes to understand how these skills are involved. And I think there's been too much reliance on correlational studies, so we need to think more cleverly about how we can look at some of these mechanisms and processes. And then, as I've said, we need to know more about how the mathematical activities that children do and the experiences they have might interact with their cognitive skills to influence their learning. So in particular, like how might children with different profiles of domain general and domain specific skills engage in different ways with mathematical activities and learn different things from them. And this is really key if we want mathematical cognition research to actually have some impact on mathematics education, then we've got to do this work looking at mathematical materials and experiences. So of course all of this work was done in collaboration with many others, so thanks to all of my colleagues and collaborators and students involved in these studies, and also acknowledge that this work was all taken from projects funded by a range of different funders. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to any comments or questions that you have.